August 14th, 1977, 2 a.m. Elvis Presley sat alone in his bedroom at Graceland, unable to sleep despite the cocktail of medications he'd taken hours earlier. In his restless state, he began going through an old wooden box he kept in his closet, filled with personal items from throughout his life. Near the bottom of the box, beneath old letters and concert programs, Elvis found a small black and white photograph he hadn't looked at in years. The photo showed a young man, barely recognizable as Elvis, standing outside a grocery store in Memphis. He was wearing ordinary clothes, jeans and a plain shirt. He was smiling, but not the famous Elvis smile. This was different, genuine, unguarded, free. Elvis turned the photo over and read what he'd written on the back in faded ink 20 years earlier. September 18th, 1956. Last day nobody knew my name. Last day I was just me. Last happy day. Elvis stared at those words for a long time, tears streaming down his face. Then he did something he'd never done before. He took a pen and added new words beneath the old message. I was wrong. It wasn't my last happy day. It was my last real day. Everything after this was performance, even when I was alone, especially when I was alone. 2 days later, Elvis Presley was dead, and that photograph was found under his pillow. September 18th, 1956. Elvis Presley woke up in his modest apartment in Memphis, knowing his life was about to change forever. His single, Don't Be Cruel, had just hit #1 on the charts. Tomorrow, September 19th, he was scheduled to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show, a performance that would be watched by 60 million Americans, over 82% of the entire television audience. Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had been very clear. After the Sullivan Show, Elvis would become a national phenomenon. His privacy would essentially end. Every moment of his life would belong to the public. There would be no more anonymity, no more normal days, no more just being Elvis Aaron Presley from Tupelo, Mississippi. Enjoy today, Colonel Parker had told him the night before. It's the last normal day you'll ever have. Elvis didn't fully understand what the colonel meant. He was 21 years old, excited about his growing success, eager for what was coming. But some part of him, some instinct, told him to pay attention to this day, to remember it. So Elvis did something unusual. He took his camera with him and asked a stranger to take his picture in front of Bill's grocery store on Main Street. Just a simple photo. Nothing special. Just him being himself before everything changed. That day, September 18th, 1956, Elvis did ordinary things. He went to the grocery store and bought milk, bread, and his favorite candy bars. The cashier recognized him. His record had been playing on local radio for months, but she just smiled and said, "I like your music." She didn't ask for an autograph. She didn't scream. She just rang up his groceries like he was any other customer. Elvis walked down Beale Street looking in shop windows, watching people go about their lives. A few people nodded at him. One or two said, "Hey, aren't you that singer?" But mostly, people left him alone. He was just another young man walking down the street on a Tuesday afternoon. He stopped at a diner and ordered a burger and a Coke. He sat at the counter, ate slowly, listened to the jukebox. Someone had put on one of his songs, Hound Dog, and the waitress said, "You sound like that Elvis fellow." He smiled and said, "I get that a lot." She laughed and went back to work. That evening, Elvis drove out to Riverside Park and sat by the water, watching the sunset. He didn't have bodyguards. He didn't have fans following him. He didn't have photographers hiding in bushes. He was just alone with his thoughts, watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple. And he was happy. Not excited happy or successful happy or famous happy, just content, at peace, himself. Elvis didn't know it then, but he would never feel that way again. September 19th, 1956. Elvis appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. The performance was exactly as historic as Colonel Parker had predicted. 60 million people watched Elvis sing Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender, and Hound Dog. The next day, Elvis Presley was the most famous person in America. And just like that, normal life ended. Within days, Elvis couldn't go to a grocery store without being mobbed. He couldn't walk down Beale Street without causing a riot. He couldn't eat at a diner without every customer stopping their meals to stare at him. He couldn't sit by a river alone without fans somehow finding him. His privacy vanished overnight. His freedom disappeared. The simple pleasures of anonymous life, walking, shopping, eating, sitting, became impossible unless he was surrounded by security and protection. Elvis tried, at first, to maintain some normalcy. But every attempt ended the same way: crowds, chaos, screaming, grabbing. So eventually, he stopped trying. He retreated into controlled environments, private homes, rented venues, closed sets, anywhere the public couldn't reach him. But in retreating from the public, Elvis also retreated from normal life. And he missed it desperately. Sometime in late 1956, a few months after the Ed Sullivan appearance, Elvis developed the photograph he'd taken on September 18th. When he saw it, he was struck by how different he looked from the person he'd become. In the photo, his face was relaxed, his smile was genuine, his eyes were clear and unguarded. The Elvis in the photograph looked free. The Elvis in the mirror looked trapped. Elvis wrote on the back of the photo, September 18th, 1956. Last day nobody knew my name. Last day I was just me. Last happy day. Then he put the photo in a wooden box and never showed it to anyone. Over the years, people close to Elvis would occasionally ask about his life before fame. "Do you miss being unknown?" they'd ask. "Do you wish you could go back?" Elvis would always give the same public answer: "No way, I'm living the dream. This is what I always wanted." But alone at night, Elvis would sometimes take out that photograph and stare at the stranger in it. The young man who could buy groceries without being mobbed, who could eat a burger without being photographed, who could sit by a river without being found. As the years passed, Elvis began to understand something that terrified him. He wasn't just performing on stage anymore. He was performing all the time, every moment of every day. When he woke up, he had to be Elvis Presley. When he ate breakfast, when he talked to friends, when he tried to relax, he was always performing the role of Elvis Presley for whoever was around him: his staff, his entourage, his girlfriends, even his family. He couldn't just be himself, because he'd forgotten who that was. The real Elvis, the one from that photograph, had disappeared somewhere between September 18th and September 19th, 1956. And Elvis didn't know how to find him again. In a 1972 conversation with his longtime friend Jerry Schilling, Elvis tried to explain this feeling. "You know what the worst part of fame is? It's not the lack of privacy, it's the lack of reality. I can't remember the last time I had a real conversation with someone who wasn't working for me or wanting something from me. I can't remember the last time someone saw me as just a person instead of as Elvis Presley. Hell, I can't remember the last time I saw myself as just a person," Jerry asked. "When did it change? When did you stop being yourself?" Elvis thought for a moment. September 19th, 1956, the day after the Ed Sullivan Show. That's when Elvis Presley, the person, died, and Elvis Presley, the product, was born. August 14th, 1977, 2 days before his death, Elvis found that photograph again. He read what he'd written 20 years earlier about it being his last happy day. And he realized he'd been wrong. It wasn't his last happy day. There had been other moments of happiness over the years: his wedding to Priscilla, the birth of Lisa Marie, certain performances where he connected with the music in a pure way. But September 18th, 1956 was his last real day, his last day of authentic existence. After that, everything became performance, even his private moments, even his relationships, even his self-concept. So Elvis added those new words to the photograph. "I was wrong. It wasn't my last happy day. It was my last real day. Everything after this was performance, even when I was alone, especially when I was alone." Then Elvis did something that surprised even himself. He took the photograph out of the wooden box where he'd kept it hidden for 20 years. He carried it to his bedroom, and he placed it under his pillow. Why? He couldn't fully explain it. Maybe he wanted to be close to that younger, freer version of himself. Maybe he wanted to sleep next to the reminder of who he'd been before fame consumed him. Maybe he was just tired of hiding the truth from himself. On August 16th, 1977, when Elvis was found dead in his bathroom at Graceland, the immediate focus was on the medical crisis. Paramedics, doctors, staff members, all rushing around trying to save him, then trying to understand what had happened. It wasn't until later that day, when someone was preparing Elvis's bedroom for the family's arrival, that the photograph was discovered under his pillow. At first, the staff member almost threw it away, thinking it was just another old picture. But something made her turn it over and read what was written on the back. She read Elvis's words from 1956 about his last day of normalcy and happiness. Then she read the words Elvis had added just 2 days before his death. And she understood that this wasn't just an old photograph. This was Elvis's final message about what he'd lost and what he'd spent 20 years mourning. The photograph was given to Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. Vernon read the words on the back and wept. He'd watched his son become the most famous entertainer in the world. He'd watched Elvis achieve everything he'd ever dreamed of achieving. But he'd also watched Elvis become increasingly isolated, increasingly unhappy, increasingly trapped by the very success he'd worked so hard to achieve. And now, Vernon understood that Elvis had been carrying this loss, the loss of his real self, for 20 years. And he'd hidden it from everyone, even the people who loved him most. Vernon showed the photograph to Priscilla during the funeral preparations. Priscilla read the words and understood, perhaps for the first time, why her marriage to Elvis had been so difficult. She'd been trying to have a real relationship with someone who didn't feel real anymore, who'd lost his authentic self 20 years before they'd even met. "He wrote this 2 days before he died," Priscilla said quietly. "After all these years, after all his success, after everything he achieved, he was still thinking about September 18th, 1956. That one normal day. That's what he wanted back." Vernon nodded. "I remember that day. He came home so happy that evening. Just happy for no particular reason. I asked him why he was smiling, and he said, 'I just had a really good day, Daddy. That's all. Just a really good day.' I didn't understand then what he meant. I thought there'd be thousands more days like that. But there weren't. There was only that one." The photograph wasn't included in Elvis's casket. Vernon couldn't bear to bury it. Instead, it became one of his most treasured possessions. He would take it out occasionally and look at the young man in the picture, his son, before fame, before pressure, before the weight of being Elvis Presley crushed the real person underneath. For years after Elvis's death, the photograph remained private, known only to Vernon and a few close family members. But in 1995, Vernon passed away, and in accordance with his will, many of Elvis's personal items were transferred to Graceland for preservation and display. Among those items was the photograph from September 18th, 1956, along with the words Elvis had written on the back. The curators at Graceland debated whether to display it. The words were so personal, so sad, so revealing of Elvis's inner pain. Did the public have a right to see them? Ultimately, they decided to include the photograph in an exhibit about Elvis's relationship with fame, not to exploit his pain, but to help people understand the cost of what he achieved. The photograph, with Elvis's handwritten words visible, became one of the most visited items at Graceland. Visitors would stand in front of it, reading Elvis's words about his last real day, and many would cry. Not because they felt sorry for Elvis, but because they recognized something universal in his experience. The feeling of losing yourself to expectations, to performance, to the roles you have to play. Elvis's loss was more dramatic and complete than most people's, but the fundamental experience of losing touch with your authentic self was something many people understood. The photograph Elvis kept hidden for 20 years tells a story about the price of fame that few people understand. It's easy to look at Elvis's life and see only the glamour, the success, the achievement, but this photograph reveals what was lost in the pursuit of all that. On September 18th, 1956, Elvis Presley was a person, a real, authentic person who could buy groceries and eat burgers and sit by rivers and just be himself. On September 19th, 1956, he became a product, a brand, a performance. And somewhere in that transformation, the real person got lost. Elvis spent the next 21 years, the rest of his life, mourning that loss. He kept a photograph of his last normal day hidden away because looking at it was too painful. It reminded him of everything he'd sacrificed, everything he'd lost, everything he could never get back. The tragedy is that Elvis achieved his dream. He became the most successful entertainer of his generation. He had fame, wealth, adoration. But in achieving that dream, he lost himself. And no amount of success could compensate for that loss. The photograph under Elvis's pillow when he died wasn't there by accident. It was there because, at the end of his life, Elvis wanted to be close to the last version of himself that had been real. He wanted to sleep next to the reminder of who he'd been before fame made authenticity impossible. The photo Elvis kept hidden for 20 years wasn't just a picture. It was a memorial to the person he used to be, the life he used to have, the freedom he used to feel. September 18th, 1956 was his last normal day. Everything after that was performance, even when he was alone, especially when he was alone. And in the end, that performance killed him.